87 millionaires revealed their biggest regret before death. And if you think it had anything to do with money, you're wrong. I spent decades as a private nurse, caring for some of the wealthiest individuals in this country during the final chapters of their lives. I lived in their homes, sat at their tables, and held their hands in the quiet hours of the night when everything else had gone silent. I watched 87 of them take their last breath. And I want you to understand something that most people never get to see. These were people who had already won the game everyone else is still playing. They had the houses, the accounts, the status, the freedom that most spend their entire lives chasing. And yet, when everything was stripped away, when there was nothing left to prove and no one left to impress, a different truth began to surface. It wasn't about how much they made. It wasn't about what they owned. And it definitely wasn't about wanting more. What I saw over and over again was something much quieter and much more painful. A deep, undeniable regret that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what they had traded to get it. I'm not going to tell you that money doesn't matter, because that wouldn't be honest. I've seen what it means to live without security, to wonder if there will be enough to survive the next week. That kind of fear leaves marks on you. But there is a point, and it comes much sooner than most people realize, where having more no longer adds to your life. It begins to take from it. Not because money is evil, but because what you sacrifice in the process is something you don't get back. I remember one of them telling me something I will never forget. He said, "I thought I had time. I thought I could come back to what really mattered, but I was wrong. And by the time I realized it, there was nothing left to come back to." So before you keep going, before you tell yourself that you'll figure it out later, I need you to listen carefully. Because what these 87 people discovered at the end of their lives might be the one thing that changes yours before it's too late. They didn't talk about the deals they closed or the wealth they built, not in those final moments. What stayed with them were the things they couldn't measure, the conversations they postponed, the time they thought they could reclaim. I remember sitting beside one man who had built an empire most people could only dream of. His name was Daniel. He wasn't afraid of dying. What haunted him was the realization that he had spent decades preparing for a life he never actually lived. He told me that every time his family asked for his time, he gave them a promise instead. A promise that later would be better. Later would be easier. Later would come. But later never arrived the way he expected. And when he finally had the time, the people he wanted to share it with had already learned how to live without him. There is something people don't tell you about success. It teaches you how to sacrifice, but it doesn't teach you when to stop. You keep going because it feels responsible. It feels necessary. And at first it is. You build, you grow, you secure your future. But at some point, the line moves. And instead of working to live, you start living to work. I saw this pattern repeat itself again and again. People who were incredibly disciplined, incredibly focused, incredibly driven, but completely disconnected from the life happening around them. Not because they didn't care, but because they believed there would always be time to come back to it. One of the most painful things I witnessed was not what people lost, but what they slowly let slip away without noticing. Relationships don't break all at once. They fade, quietly, gradually, through missed dinners, delayed calls, and conversations that never happen. I remember a woman who kept a box beside her bed filled with letters. Letters from her children that she never responded to. Not because she didn't love them, but because she was always busy. Always just finishing something. In her final days, she asked me to read those letters back to her. And as I did, she wept. Not for what was written, but for all the moments she let pass unanswered. Time has a way of revealing what truly matters, but it often waits until you can no longer act on it. That's the cruel part. Clarity comes late, and when it comes, it's sharp. There were people who had everything arranged perfectly. Financial security, assets, plans for generations ahead. But none of those plans included presence. None of them included the simple act of being there, fully, without distraction. And in the end, that's what they missed the most. Not what they built, but what they didn't experience. You might think this won't happen to you, that you'll be the exception, that you'll find a way to balance it all, and maybe you will. But every single person I cared for believed the same thing at some point in their life. They believed they were in control, that they were making temporary sacrifices for a permanent reward. But life doesn't pause while you figure things out. It moves, quietly, constantly, and it takes moments with it that you never get back. I remember another man who said something that stayed with me. He told me, I was so focused on building a future that I forgot to be part of the present. And when he said it, there was no anger in his voice, just a quiet acceptance. That's what makes it heavier. Because regret at the end of life isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It settles. It sits with you. And there is nothing you can do to change it. There's a difference between providing and being present, and many people confuse the two. Providing feels like love. It feels like responsibility. But presence is what people remember. It's what stays. You can give someone everything they need materially and still leave them feeling unseen. I saw that more times than I can count. Families that had everything except connection. Children who respected their parents but didn't feel close to them because time was replaced with things. What shocked me the most was how similar these stories were. Different backgrounds, different industries, different lives, but the same ending. The same realization that what they thought mattered most wasn't what stayed with them. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the achievements. It was the absence, the missed presence. The life that was happening while they were somewhere else, focused on something else. And here's the part most people don't want to hear. You don't notice it while it's happening. That's what makes it dangerous. You don't wake up one day and realize you're trading your life away. It happens in small decisions. One more hour, one more task, one more delay, and over time, those small choices become your life. There was a moment that changed the way I saw everything. I was sitting beside a patient who had been silent for hours. Then suddenly he looked at me and said, "None of it followed me here." And I knew exactly what he meant. All the things he spent his life chasing, they didn't come with him. What remained were his thoughts, his memories, and the weight of what he didn't do. If you could sit in those rooms the way I did, if you could hear what people say when there is nothing left to protect, you would understand how little it takes to live a meaningful life and how easily it can be lost. It's not about abandoning ambition. It's about not letting it replace your life. You don't need to wait for a wake-up call. You don't need to reach the end to understand this. That's why I'm telling you now. Because every single person I cared for would have given anything for one more chance. Not to earn more, not to build more, but simply to be present. So before you continue chasing what you believe will make everything feel complete, take a moment and ask yourself something honest. What are you trading for it? Because whatever it is, the cost is being paid right now. And the only question that matters is whether it's worth it.